What do you like? Tell me what you like.
There's value in that because it almost gives the brain like a vacation, right?
Holistic health is completely underappreciated, but so critical. Eating whole foods, and the key is just to find something that you really enjoy.
Welcome to the NAMP Nourishing You podcast. I'm Kristen Burkett.
And I'm Diana Wally. We're your hosts for NAMP's podcast dedicated to connecting holistic health enthusiasts with each other to share practical information from the holistic wellness space for enhanced vitality.
Diana and I are master nutrition therapists, board certified in holistic nutrition with private practices and an online joint venture that supports clients and practitioners as they strive to reach their full potential. We're honored to be hosting this podcast for NAMP and connecting our listeners with the latest in holistic wellness.
And if you enjoyed today's show, help us out by commenting below, liking this video, and subscribing to the channel to help us spread the word.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Nourishing You podcast. We're so happy to have Dr. Tom Fabian with us today to talk about this fascinating topic of gut health and how it affects our mood and immune system. Tom is a leading expert on the role of the microbiome in health, immune function, chronic disease, and aging. As a translational scientist, his primary focus is on the clinical application of microbiome research in the functional and integrative medicine space. He is currently a consultant and science advisor for Diagnostic Solutions Laboratory, and he also serves as a science advisor for Designs for Health. Previously, he was a consultant on microbiome testing for Viome and Vibrant America. Tom is certified as a Nutrition Therapy Practitioner by the Nutrition Therapy Institute in Denver, and he also provides educational services and courses for practitioners. Tom, it's so good to have our longtime friend, colleague, teacher, and nature enthusiast with us today.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Diana and Kristen. It's great to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's so great to see you again, Tom. The three of us go back a long time, and it's been a real privilege to watch your career really take off over the years. And I want to say how much I admire how you practice what you preach. We were talking just before the Zoom call here, how it was so fun to connect on a hiking trail in Boulder, Colorado in the fall. You were out enjoying nature and, of course, tending to your microbiome.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I try to, as best as I can, sort of walk the talk. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a fascinating field to be in, very rewarding.
And Tom, I just personally want to thank you because you have been instrumental in my education and appreciation of all things gut in my practice, which is now really the focus of my practice. So thank you, because I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if it hadn't been for you.
My pleasure, and definitely thank you.
So nowadays, everyone has heard the term microbiome. My mother talks about it, and clients ask me all the time, what foods to eat, what supplements should I take to feed my microbiome? And I think we forget that this verbiage hasn't been around for very long, even if the concept isn't new. I read that the term wasn't coined until 2001, which is hard to believe. So to kick things off, we'd love to hear about your story and what set you on the trajectory to focus on the microbiome and its role in our health before this was such a ubiquitous term.
Well, it's actually kind of a long and winding journey, so much more than I could kind of put into a nutshell. But really, kind of my interest in health goes way back to when I was a teenager. And I had a couple of close relatives, my father and also my grandmother, that had significant health issues. So heart disease, grandmother had dementia. So I really took an interest in, at that age, what can be done to help improve health and help sort of reduce the chance that those things will happen as we get older. So I actually, even though I was pretty young, took a big interest in aging, and then decided if I wanted to do something about it, I had to really look into going to grad school, getting a doctorate so I could start doing research. So that was really my first career, was in scientific research, specializing in the area of molecular biology in general. in applying that to studying the process of aging. So it was really kind of back then, it was sort of a pioneering field. We knew a lot less back then than we know now. And this was actually before that. You mentioned that the microbiome term was coined in 2001. So this was before that, in the decade before that, we hadn't heard much yet about the microbiome. It's still about the genome and a lot of focus on genes, and we were looking at genetics of aging. So that essentially was my initial career. I was in academic research and then also worked for a couple of biotech companies. And then I decided to transition out of that and eventually found my way to holistic and functional nutrition, which I thought was a great way to sort of combine the background that I have in research with applying that information in the real world. And since then, I've sort of branched out and done a variety of things, including developing courses on the microbiome. But currently, my main focus is consulting with clinical testing companies in the microbiome space, and also with supplement companies as well. So it's been a bit of a long journey. After I received my nutrition certification, of course, like a lot of us, I was trying to figure out what would be my area of focus. And I was also kind of getting back into the science research at that point and realizing the microbiome had become a really big area in those intervening years. I just thought it had so much potential, really to help us understand more about how diet affects health, for example. So I started reading more and more about it and just kind of became really engrossed in the topic. And sort of one thing led to another, and here I am. And that's really my area of focus now. I consider myself a translational scientist in the field of functional medicine and functional nutrition. So I spend a lot of time digesting the research, figuring out how that applies to better understanding these clinical tests that have to do with gut health and the microbiome, and then really how that can be applied to help improve what we're doing in terms of nutrition, especially personalized nutrition, recognizing how these pieces fit together to tell us what may work for an individual that may not work for someone else.
Oh, that's awesome. Tom, I learn more about you every time we speak. And thanks for clarifying that term, translational scientist, because I don't know that a lot of people in our audience, including myself, have really heard that term before, but that makes total sense, taking what's academic and translating it into something real that we can use in our daily life. And, thank goodness there's people like you in this world doing that, because that's the only way we can have it be effective for us. So thanks for your work.
It's my pleasure. Yeah, I think it's a big focus to try to just continue to help moving the field forward. And as we all know, if you look at the research, it's sort of like drinking from the fire hose. There's just so much out there. And as clinicians, we're not necessarily trained for how to take that information and figure out how to use it. So that's really a lot of my focus, is to take that complex information, technical information, in a way that's understandable by both clinicians and eventually patients and clients as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful. So can you start us off for our audience, just giving us a general overview of what do we mean by this term gut health? What does that encompass? And then why is that so important?
That's a great question. So there is a large focus in our field on gut health. And in the big picture, it really has to do with the fact that it's sort of the main interface between the environment and our health. So when you think about just all the things that we're exposed to, so of course diet is sort of number one in terms of just the environmental factors that we're exposed to. The surface area of the GI tract is really the largest surface area of the body. And so that provides kind of a really large, they say it's sort of on the order of magnitude of a tennis court almost. When you think about all the things that we're exposed to, good and bad, all the good nutrients from food, but also some of the not so good things that can be in food, especially processed foods, toxins, contaminants, etc. So that's part of the picture, is that it's really this major interface between the environment, what we're exposed to, and then microbiome is right there kind of in between. And it has this really close sort of interaction with our GI tract. So of course, traditionally we know that a key role of the GI tract is for digestion and absorption. So that's how we get all those great nutrients out of the foods that we're consuming that nourish our bodies. But it turns out that the research is showing that the microbiome can play a role all along that process. So some microbes can actually influence how we digest food, how we absorb food, and then they can actually take some of those food components and convert them either to beneficial health-promoting components, or in some cases, the not-so-good microbes can convert them into products that may have potentially negative effects. So gut health really, I think, you think about it, the big picture, comes down to balance. So we don't really necessarily want to focus on getting rid of all the bad things, because they do play a role. They kind of, in some ways, for example, they kind of keep our immune system in tune. You need to have some of those bad guys around every once in a while to kind of keep the immune system on its toes. But ultimately, you really want the good things to prevail. So I'm sure we'll probably pick up on that theme throughout our discussion today on balance. But that's really how I like to kind of frame the picture, is thinking about gut health as being defined largely by a good balance. That balance is going to vary a little bit from person to person, depending on your genes, your history, your health history, etc. So what's good for you may be a little different from what's good for someone else. But that's really the role of a great practitioner, is helping clients decide and determine what's going to be promoting their health for their individual situation. The last thing I'll sort of add on that topic is we're learning more and more about sort of this holistic picture of the gut, the integrative picture. And so when we talk about the microbiome, originally we sort of just talked about the microbiome. Now we know that there's a microbiome, of course, in the mouth. There's a microbiome in the stomach. There's a microbiome in the esophagus, small intestine, large intestine. And even within those organs, there can be some regional differences. So, of course, from a science end, that gets kind of complicated. But the good news is it's really giving us a lot more information that clinicians can work with to dial in what's going to work for a given individual with all this new information that we're getting, especially from the new tests that are out there.
So Tom, is there a way, speaking of gut health in particular, is there a way to know if our gut health is off?
Absolutely. So really the main ways, of course, would be symptoms, certainly diagnosed conditions, especially if they're known to involve imbalances in the gut. But it's so common for patients to have a variety of symptoms. So, of course, common symptoms would be things like bloating, abdominal distension, kind of a feeling of fullness or discomfort after you eat, changes in bowel habits, tendency towards looser stools, more concentrated or towards constipation. So those sorts of scenarios are really, really common. And so symptoms are really a good guide. It's also important to note that it's not limited to just GI symptoms. So it's actually fairly common for patients to have symptoms elsewhere in the body that originate in the gut. So when we're talking about initially about the role and the importance of gut health, part of that is because it can influence health throughout the body. A really strong connection that we see frequently in the work that I do is the gut-skin connection. There's also the gut-brain connection, the gut-lung connection. Virtually to any other system in the body, there's going to be a connection with the gut. And so a lot of those times, research is revealing, and we start to see this clinically as well, that you can have issues elsewhere in the body, brain fog, mood issues, joint pain, etc., that may originate, or at least the gut may have a role in contributing to those scenarios. The other piece of that is testing. So I'm not sure how much you'll want to talk about testing, but that can be another great way beyond symptoms to reveal the specifics of what may be going on for a patient or client.
Before we get into that, and I would actually like to hear some more about that, but you mentioned the microbiome as being a part of gut health. Can you just more fully describe what you mean by the microbiome? What is that? Like, what's it composed of? Where is it? What does that mean?
That's a really awesome question. So, we hear that word all the time. We assume everybody knows what it means because those of us who are working in the field are familiar with it. But it's basically the collection of microbes that live in whatever part of your body we're talking about. So they mostly live on what we consider to be surfaces. So that includes typically the skin, and then especially the mucosa. So all the mucosal membranes that line your whole digestive tract, your respiratory tract, etc. And that's really where the concentration of microbes tends to be, particularly in the gut. So if you go along the gut from the mouth all the way down to the colon, generally the number of microbes increases, and especially in the colon, it increases dramatically. You can have literally into the billions of microbes per gram of stool. And so in terms of the microbes that make up that microbiome, the specifics are going to vary along the GI tract depending on the details of physiological factors, what sorts of nutrients are available to them. But by and large, the microbiome is composed of sort of, just in terms of the full mass, bacteria as number one. But there are also other microbes that are normal to an extent. So there can be some fungi, yeast, candida is a common one that we hear about clinically. There can be viruses, both viruses that infect human cells, but also viruses that infect the other microbes in the microbiome. So it can be this sort of complicated ecosystem where you have viruses infecting bacteria, et cetera. Then there's kind of the term parasites, which is composed of several different types of organisms. You can have helminths, otherwise known as worms, which fortunately are not as common in recent decades. And then there's also the single-celled, they're called eukaryotes, kind of a technical name, but they're basically a little more complex, larger than bacteria. We think of those as parasites, like amoeba, for example. So you have this whole ecosystem existing in the gut. And again, a big part of the microbiome is the interaction of those microbes. Just like a large ecosystem, like a rainforest, with all the different components play a role. The same is true on a microbial scale. You'll even have cases where certain microbes break down, say, fiber, and then they make products, metabolic products that then are used by other microbes for their own metabolism. So it's a highly interactive, complex ecosystem. And this is all happening in our bodies as we're talking. They're actually actively metabolizing whatever we had in our last couple of meals.
It's just so fascinating to think about all these bugs that live inside of us, and it's like this whole little community that, we don't even know is there on a day-to-day basis unless,
they cause
big symptoms. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So let's shift. I'm sorry, Kristen, did I talk over you? So let's shift a little bit and talk about gut feelings. You alluded to the fact that there's a gut-brain connection, and an aspect of your work that we find so interesting is the link between that we see in the research between gut health and our mood or emotional well-being. It appears that the gut microbiome plays a key role in supporting or hindering our mental and emotional states. So I'm wondering, is this due to that bidirectional communication, that loop that goes both ways between the gut and the brain, that gut-brain axis that you mentioned, so that if your gut is off, then your brain is off?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely what the research is showing, and especially the two-way connection. So that's important just for general understanding, but also for clinicians in understanding how you might want to approach it. Because in some cases, you may need to work on sort of both sides of that equation. But let's just talk a little bit about the gut itself and the gut-brain connection. So one of the main connections that we know about has to do with what's called the vagus nerve. So this is a particular nerve that comes from the brainstem and then innervates. We have sort of these nerve endings that go out and interact with all the various internal organs, I should say, particularly the gut. And it's a two-way connection. So basically we have, that's part of what's called the autonomic nervous system, which is your sympathetic, which is your rest and digest side of that autonomic nervous system. And then you have the sympathetic. So you have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Sympathetic is more your fight and flight type response. So that's really where you need to mobilize when there's something dangerous in the environment. So the classic example is, running from a lion or something that's chasing you. And so that basically has a big influence on the GI tract, for better or worse. So the parasympathetic, again, as I mentioned, is sort of the rest and digest. A lot of that is mediated through the vagus nerve. And that mostly affects largely the upper GI tract, so your stomach, small intestine, etc. So your ability to digest can be affected positively or negatively depending on this balance in the autonomic nervous system. So that's just a little bit about sort of how the nervous system sort of interacts with the gut, but it also goes the other direction. So you have all these nerve endings that are sensing what's going on in the gut. They're basically able to detect really specific molecules. So they're able to detect what these microbes are producing, what sorts of factors may be present in food, etc. And then they're relaying that information back to the brain. So if everything's good, basically your brain is getting positive information saying everything's fine. No need to jump into action or be overly concerned. But certainly if things are off, that can certainly set the stage for example, anxiety. There's actually research showing that when things can be off in the gut, then that can be perceived through this nervous system connection as anxiety by some patients. There are lots of other sort of ways in which the gut-brain connection can happen. That's sort of more the direct route through this nervous system connection. There's also this concept of leaky gut. So when you have a GI tract that's not as healthy as it should be, that sort of lining that separates the microbes and the contents inside the gut, which is called the lumen, then that can allow some of those factors to get across that intestinal lining, the intestinal barrier. That's called leaky gut. And then when you have that happen, there can be certain molecules that are coming from these microbes, the ones that are not so good. And then that can have an interaction with the immune system. And then we also know that there is an immune system connection with the brain as well. So I'll kind of stop there because I know you probably have some questions about that. But really, when you think about the gut-brain connection, you're thinking about largely the nervous system connection directly, and then also the immune connection.
So if we had this connection happening and something's off in our gut, and maybe you can talk about like what kinds of things might be off or out of balance that could cause these nerve signals, but how might that show up in symptoms related to mood issues aside from anxiety? Are there some other things that might, kind of make you think, oh, maybe there's something going on with my gut as well? It's not just my mood.
Definitely. Yeah. So other common symptoms that are part of that sort of gut-brain axis connection when things are out of balance, probably another one at the top of the list would be fatigue. So a lot of patients experience fatigue. Part of that picture can be because of these imbalances in the gut. So when I talk about imbalances, I'm largely talking about the balance between good bacteria and then bad bacteria, and then how they interact with the immune system, the intestinal lining. If you have too many of the bad bacteria, they can contribute to leaky gut, as I mentioned. But as far as other common symptoms. This isn't really so much of a mood issue itself, but brain fog, sort of that idea that your brain just isn't able to think clearly. You may have reduced sort of endurance. Your brain may become fatigued more easily. And then this is kind of part of that spectrum with anxiety, but some patients can have more of kind of an agitation or even kind of a stimulation effect when there's an imbalance in the gut. So that can kind of manifest in different patients in different ways. So those are just a few additional examples of some of the other imbalances that may occur when the gut-brain axis is not as healthy as it should be.
I just wanted to highlight something that you've alluded to a few times. So I've heard you say that there is good bacteria and not so good bacteria in the gut, or bad bacteria, and that we need both to be in harmony, so to speak, because I've heard many people say, oh, I don't want any bad bacteria. I want to get rid of all the bad bacteria. But are you saying that really we need some of both, just in the right balance?
That's largely what we know from research. Now, of course, you have to break that down into a little bit of detail, because the really bad guys are the pathogens. These are the ones that cause infections, things like food poisoning, for example. Of course, those are the ones you don't want at all. They can cause some significant issues, not only when there's an acute infection, but they can actually set the stage for downstream issues. For example, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, we know is a condition that often can result, sometimes months or years, after food poisoning. So those are the really bad guys. But there's also what are called opportunists. So these are normal residents of the gut, usually in low levels. And we know that, at least in some cases, they can perform some beneficial functions. So one of the key ones, for example, is they're kind of the less bad guys, because their presence helps protect, in part, against these pathogens. So that's an example specifically of how they can be helpful. Again, they can also just provide a certain stimulus for the immune system to kind of keep the immune system on its toes. But really, you want a predominance of those beneficial bacteria. And that's really, it's defined kind of by context. So there are some cases where we know that an organism is normally recognized as perfectly fine, beneficial, doesn't cause problems. But when it becomes out of balance, then it can be part of a pathogenic picture where it may be contributing to certain diseases and conditions. So there are some nuances there in terms of what situations they're essentially good, and then what situations where they may be not so good.
And then you were talking about the immune system and the potential effects of the bad guys or the pathogens leaking out of a permeable gut and wreaking havoc, so to speak, on the immune system. So can that lead to diseases down the road, chronic disease? What kind of implications do we see there?
Definitely. Yeah, it's certainly well known that can contribute to an increased risk for various conditions. So to kind of just paint the broad picture, we know when we have this sort of, the technical term for leaky gut is increased intestinal permeability. So sometimes if I use that by default, just assume I mean leaky gut. So I'll try to stick with the term leaky gut. So that is one of the key features for how these products from the not so good guys. One example is something that it's technically called lipopolysaccharide. It's called LPS just for short. So I'll refer to it as LPS, but this can be a particularly inflammatory type molecule that they produce. Once it gets into the body through a more permeable membrane, so leaky gut, it can get into the blood, then that can stimulate inflammation, low-grade inflammation. So this low-grade inflammation is something that's found in a pretty long list of chronic diseases and conditions, including autoimmune conditions. And so that can set the stage then for kind of stimulating chronic low-grade inflammation that can underlie increased risk for these conditions. Usually along with that picture, though, you also will often have a decrease in the beneficial bacteria. So part of one of their main functions is in protecting against the bad guys and kind of keeping them in check. So that's another reason why you really want to have a good, healthy microbiome, because they're actively working to help keep those opportunists and pathogens from being able to grow to larger levels where they can cause a problem. At the same time, they also produce factors that can promote a healthy intestinal lining and reduce leaky gut. And we know from all kinds of studies on these inflammatory conditions, everything from inflammatory bowel disease to a range of autoimmune conditions, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, etc., that there's this type of microbiome imbalance in general that seems to be related to most of those conditions that can then drive this imbalance in the immune system. So it's really thought to be kind of this underlying factor that may contribute to a very long list of diseases and conditions.
So it's like everything we deal with in the holistic nutrition, functional medicine world, it all boils down to this low-grade chronic inflammation and trying to figure out where is it coming from, why rebalancing the body to help take away that inflammation that triggers maybe where you might be susceptible in your own body. And I guess, when we're talking about mood, maybe it's not all in our head, right? It may be in our gut that's causing those symptoms. And now you're talking about, the immune system and how the gut and those toxins can impact the immune system.
Right.
And, even bringing that back a little bit, can you share a little bit about the gut's immune system itself, or how big a part of our immune system collectively as people, as humans, the immune system that resides in our gut? Because I find that part fascinating, and I don't think a lot of people understand that part of the connection.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's actually the presence of the immune system is really large in the GI tract. In fact, I think the estimates are something like in the order of 70 to 80% of immune cells reside in the gut.
Yeah.
Now, when you think about it, when we first talked about the importance of the gut and that the fact that the gut is one of the main, if not the main, interface between the environment and our internal physiology, we certainly want to make sure that that interaction is as healthy as it can be. And that's really the role of the immune system. So the role of the immune system is partly surveillance, just to kind of monitor what's going on. And once they detect that something is amiss, then they jump into action. So if it's a pathogen that may be able to cause an infection, that basically can trigger an immune response. And in a healthy scenario, your immune system jumps into action, deals with that pathogen, and then basically kills off the pathogen so it's not a significant issue. Of course, that doesn't always happen, unfortunately, where the pathogen can kind of get the upper hand if we don't have enough, say, beneficial bacteria. If we have a leaky gut, whatever the scenarios, we have a weak immune system. But really, that's the reason why we have such a high immune presence in the gut. As far as all the scientists out there that study this, they have concluded that probably the main reason we have all these immune cells there is because of the potential for microbes to cause so many issues. And then there's sort of the secondary issue of food sensitivities and food antigens. So part of the immune system's function there is really to differentiate good from bad. So there's all these sort of sophisticated ways that we know from research where the immune system can learn to recognize what's good and what's bad, both from microbial standpoint and then also from food. So you can imagine, of course, the vast majority of food components are harmless and they're serving as nutrients, so we want them to not cause an immune reaction. Occasionally there may be a toxin or something in there in the mix that the immune system needs to recognize as bad and then basically jump into action again to deal with that. So immune system really has a big job to do. I mean, it's basically constantly monitoring all these things that we're exposed to, trying to decide, is it a good or a bad thing? And if it's a good thing, then basically don't react. The technical term there is called tolerance, immune tolerance, which is really an important aspect of that whole balance. We're always thinking of inflammation and sort of that overreactivity of the immune system, but an equally important part of its function is to actively promote this tolerance process so that we don't unnecessarily react to things that are harmless.
So interesting. So this might be a really good place to talk about that testing aspect that you mentioned. And how do we know? Like, sometimes we have overt symptoms and we know something's wrong in our gut or our microbiome area, but oftentimes we don't have those types of symptoms, or we don't know how much they may be contributing to other things going on. So what can we do testing wise to begin to figure that out?
Great question. So probably far and away the most common type of testing is called comprehensive stool testing. So this is a test where it's not necessarily a pleasant process, but patients collect a stool sample, send it off to the lab. The lab basically does all these different types of analyses to look at primarily what kinds of microbes are there. Obviously look at the good ones, the bad ones, try to get a sense for what does that look like. Certainly whether there are any pathogens present, but also looking at some of the key physiological markers that tell us about digestion, which is really important. That's such a key part of this interaction with the microbiome. We tend to think of that as sort of separate, but again, there's these two-way interactions between digestion and microbiome, which we can talk a little bit more about. And then there's immune markers that are often included. So markers reflecting whether or not there may be food sensitivity type reactions, markers telling us about inflammation, markers telling us about leaky gut. And there can be other things, alarm type markers like, is there any detectable occult blood? So basically, the term occult means hidden. So sometimes there can be an issue in the gut where it's not obvious in the stool itself. So these tests can be really, really helpful for detecting anything from minor imbalances all the way to potentially serious conditions. So it's really a great screening tool, certainly when patients have GI symptoms that are not explained, but also, as I mentioned, for some of these other conditions around the body. We get a lot of, in the work that I do, we get a lot of clinicians that we work with who are primarily, say, in dermatology, integrative dermatology, and other areas where they'll actually run a gut test when their patients have skin issues, because they often find that at the core of those issues are imbalances in the gut. So really, again, it gives you this great overview of the microbes, the good and the bad, and also these physiological parameters like digestion, immune function, etc., that can give you some really essential insights into what's going on. And oftentimes, of course, that relates to GI symptoms, but often symptoms that are elsewhere in the body.
So I would love to hear, I'm sure the audience would too, some really practical tips for improving gut health and your gut microbiome. What can you tell us?
Really, the key ways would be certainly number one, diet. We know from thousands of studies that really what we think of is the sort of Western diet, standard American diet, that's highly processed, so it doesn't contain as much fiber. These other really helpful plant nutrients that we refer to as phytochemicals, polyphenols, that's kind of the technical name, but there are these other very important components of plant foods. So certainly diet, avoiding those processed type ingredients. Lots of research is showing, unfortunately, that some of these additives, emulsifiers, food colorings, etc., can be a problem. So I like to try to boil everything down in terms of just kind of a simple framework for how do you approach something. You look at the things you want to avoid or reduce, and then on the other side, what do you want to emphasize or increase? So you want to look at reducing processed foods, additives, really significant imbalances. We know that sugar can promote the bad guys. So avoiding excess sugar could be very important. And on the good side, focusing on higher fiber foods. So those are certainly going to be highest in plant foods like especially fruits and vegetables that also tend to have these phytochemicals. And really a balanced and diverse diet. So we know from, again, a lot of research that a healthy microbiome depends heavily on getting a variety of these different types of components so that you have this nice balanced microbiome. If you're only eating just a few small select foods, if these are the foods that you like and you just eat them kind of excessively, focus on those too much, you're not really getting the variety there. You're tending to only promote certain microbes at the expense of others. So I would say variety, again, focusing a lot on making sure you're getting plenty of the plant foods. So diet is top of the list. Digestion, kind of under-recognized in research, although in our field we certainly know how important digestion is. It's very, very important for a healthy gut in general, but also a balanced microbiome. So there's lots of research showing that if you have certain digestive imbalances, such as low stomach acid, you're not producing enough pancreatic enzymes, etc., bile acids, so the bile that's produced by the liver goes out through the gallbladder, that helps with fat absorption. That's all really important to make sure that not only, of course, you're digesting your food well and getting your nutrients, but your microbiome makes use of these nutrients, and it needs them in the right sort of places, the right proportion. If you're not really digesting well, one of the key consequences is that those undigested foods end up down further into the colon where they're not normally present at high levels. And that can really throw off the balance of the microbes, especially in the colon. So really, I would say digestion is also very, very important. And then probably a third one would be just sort of a variety of lifestyle factors. A lot of it sort of relates to this promoting a healthy gut-brain connection. Stress certainly would be way at the top of the list for a variety of reasons. We know that stress can reduce digestion, so it can affect one of those other key factors. So then it affects how we digest our food, what nutrients we get. But we also know that other specific sort of, whether they're neurotransmitters or hormones that are part of that stress response, they can promote leaky gut, for example. So again, they have another way where they can set the stage for this increase in problems that then can potentially cause diseases and conditions down the line. Sleep is extremely important, sort of the whole picture of circadian rhythms. We know that the microbiome, just like the rest of our physiology, evolved sort of as used to this daily rhythm of dark and light cycles, etc. So when you're not getting enough sleep, you're exposed to bright lights, especially blue light late at night. An increasing number of studies are showing that that can have a negative effect on your microbiome. And of course, then that can have a negative effect on your health as well. So I would say those are really kind of the top three categories: the diet, digestion, and then the sort of things related to the gut-brain axis that are kind of more on the lifestyle side of things.
Yeah. So, I think one thing I've noticed in working with clients is oftentimes, when you are trying to work with people to increase their fruit and vegetable intake, then that's when you kind of get the awareness that digestion might be off, because some people have a really hard time bringing in different vegetables into their diet because it causes digestive symptoms. So that might be one clue that something's off in your digestive tract, right? Or with your microbiome. And then also, like you said, with digestion, I find a lot of people really bypass the whole mechanism to get digestion to work in the first place, because we eat so fast in our society. And a lot of people are working while they're eating or in the car while they're eating, and they miss that whole first pass of digestion where we're chewing our food and telling our stomach acid to produce, and that makes all of the other digestive enzymes produce. So when we bypass that, we can't even really digest what we're eating. And so it leads to a lot of those issues that you're talking about. So like maybe a place to start is just start paying attention to how you eat and then see what other things come up when you're doing that well to see if you need to go even further, I guess. What do you think about that?
Agree 100%. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely essential. But it makes a lot of sense from sort of a lot of different standpoints, because if you are just taking the time to chew your food and enjoy it, that sort of sensory experience is actually sending information to your brain that's preparing the subsequent steps in digestion. So if you're just taking a bite of something really quick and wolfing it down, you're not only just literally not chewing that well enough so that your digestive system has a harder time breaking that down. You're also not getting those subtle cues that your body is used to, that it needs to optimize digestion. So I definitely have found that that's essential. Patients, clients that are just sort of like that type A, where they're just trying to rush through everything, accomplish 10 times more than they necessarily need to. They're always eating on the run, and they're eating while they're doing other things. It's hard to do. I know that's we're all sort of on that. Got to get a lot of things done, and it seems like, I can multitask here. But that's just, I think you really hit the nail on the head. That's just a particularly important period of time where we really do have to prioritize that, because it is just so important. And one last thing, I don't want to sort of belabor that point, but we just see this all the time, that poor digestion is such a major factor causing these microbiome imbalances. And then those are the things that can lead to further problems. So if you're not digesting well, and some of that just has to do with behavioral things, how you're eating, and technically these things, they are things that you can influence. You just have to sort of set the stage for yourself for how do you accomplish that.
Sometimes it's the simplest things. I'm not saying that that's easy, because I don't always follow that advice, but it's simple. So I think that's a great place to start.
Absolutely. I would agree 100%.
Yeah. So Tom, as our microbiome master, we would love to know, how do you incorporate all of these things into your life to really promote a healthy gut and a healthy gut microbiome?
Great question. So as far as, I don't necessarily practice everything I preach, because, who out there is perfect, but right. I really do prioritize the diet piece. Fortunately for me, that's pretty easy. I like all these good, healthy foods. So focusing on making sure I'm getting a really good amount and variety of fruits and vegetables every day. And I do try to mix that up a bit. So I do, like many of us, tend to eat somewhat seasonally. So I don't necessarily eat the exact same sorts of foods throughout the year. Whatever's in season, I tend to emphasize more. But variety is really something that I definitely incorporate. And I think it's also just makes eating more enjoyable when you have something different each time to focus on. So that's a big part of it. I tend to avoid excess protein. So there's actually a fair amount of research now that therapeutically high protein diets have a place. They're not necessarily meant to be long-term. There is a lot of research that shows that high protein diets, especially if you're not digesting all that well, can counteract some of those beneficial effects of the plant foods like fruits and vegetables. So I personally follow more of a paleo type diet. Probably you would categorize it as sort of paleo-Mediterranean. And that's partly because, as I mentioned early on, that heart disease runs in the family. So that's an approach that I feel is very helpful for me in managing all those markers that are related to risk. And then aside from the diet piece, I do follow some level of intermittent fasting, which I personally find very beneficial. I think as we all get older, we know that our metabolism tends to slow down, and eating the same things that you've been eating in the same quantities, it's sometimes that weight starts to creep up in those cases. And I think a lot of people have found that the intermittent fasting is just another fairly easy thing to implement to help maintain metabolic health. And I really do well on that. I actually will go for long hikes without I don't take any food with me, don't have any breakfast before I go. And your body does learn to adapt to that. And I would say exercise just in general. There's a lot of really great research on the benefits of kind of the optimal amount of exercise. So I think just like anything, too little or too much can be a problem. Research certainly bears that out. But staying active, avoiding too much sitting, which is challenging when you have a sort of a computer-based job. But staying active, I think, is just overall really important. Probably the one I don't do as well is the sleep. Mm-hmm. That one is always a bit of a challenge for me because I like to work long hours because I read a lot of the research papers, etc. Sometimes that's the only time of the day that I have to do some of that reading. So that's probably the one area where I personally have more of a challenge to really make sure that that's happening.
And I really, when you were talking about fasting, I really want to give you credit. You were way ahead of the curve with the microbiome work, but also with fasting, because it was maybe 6-7 years ago that I was at one of your classes or a lecture, and you had suggested trying intermittent fasting for gut health. And it was the first time that I'd ever heard that. And boy, that for me, that was a magic bullet. I mean, that helped so much. So thank you for that. And in another way that you're really ahead of the curve.
That was my pleasure. I just think it's, you have to really prepare yourself metabolically for that.
Yes.
Not everyone is at that point where they can just jump right in, but
right.
For a lot of people, I think it can really help a lot. Yeah. That's great to hear.
And I did take it slowly. I did, ramp up slowly. So, just at the tail end of what you were saying, having a computer job, loving what you do, talk to us a little bit about, we know that you work for a lab testing company and you do consulting. So tell us, for different lab companies, tell us about that.
Well, I'm currently working, am I allowed to mention the company?
Absolutely.
So I currently work with Diagnostic Solutions Laboratory. They're best known for the comprehensive stool test known as GI MAP. And we have a number of other tests as well, but that's kind of our sort of flagship test. So a lot of our consults that we do, so there's a whole team of us, a team of 10 clinical educators with varied backgrounds, some PhDs, some naturopathic clinicians, some folks who have masters in nutrition, et cetera. So we have a really great sort of well-rounded team. And so when clinicians want to learn more about just the test in general, or they want assistance with interpreting a test result, they actually schedule appointments, 30-minute appointments that are free of charge, where they can talk with one of these clinical education consultants. So I've been working with Diagnostic Solutions Lab now for about 4 years or so, and I sort of did a rough sort of back of the envelope calculation recently that I probably have reviewed somewhere close to 10,000 patient reports. So I've been exposed to a very large number of patient cases in that route. I don't really do so much of my own one-on-one client consulting anymore due to lack of time. So that's most of my patient and client experiences indirect through other clinicians. So they'll basically give me a quick synopsis of the patient's issues from their perspective, what they've concluded so far. Then I look at the tests, typically on the fly, and then help them connect the dots, try to figure out how what we're seeing on the test may provide some insights into what's going on for those patients. And it's been an amazing learning experience. We get patients with a very wide range of conditions. And when I combine that with all this research that I'm reading up on, really it's an amazing experience to be able to try to connect those dots.
Well, I know that every time I call in for a consult, I'm always so excited when your name is the one that pops on the list of who I get to talk to. So
I've actually requested, and then I have to wait,
yeah,
for he's so popular.
Takes a while to get in to talk to him.
Yeah.
But, well, it really is a great service.
It is. It is a great service that they provide. And I think it's great that we have this range of expertise on our team, because I do tend to be more on the geeky, giving you the little bit more technical explanations, which some clinicians really appreciate, because having that more technical detail, whereas others, kind of want to talk to someone who's more actively working with patients and maybe be able to speak more to specific, sort of therapeutic type scenarios.
Yeah. Well, we're up on time. Hard to believe. Tom, we cannot thank you enough for sharing your expertise, your 10,000 hours of, or 10,000 cases you've reviewed. Having that expertise is so appreciative, and we know how busy you are. So carving out this time was just great. Thank you.
It was my great pleasure today. So thanks again. I really appreciate it. And it's great to be part of your podcast.
Yeah, and thanks everyone out there for tuning in. We can't wait to see you next time. Until then, be well.
If you'd like to access other episodes or subscribe so you don't miss a beat, you can find us at nanp.org/NANP-podcast.
Membership in the NANP provides you with a competitive advantage. Whether you're a current practitioner or a student, we want you to become an active, informed leader of the holistic nutrition community and join today at nanp.org. NANP is very proud to provide the highest level of professional recognition and validation in the holistic nutrition industry through the board certification in holistic nutrition credential. To earn this valuable designation, candidates must demonstrate an exceptional level of knowledge and understanding of holistic nutrition by passing a board exam and documenting client contact hours. Are you ready to boost your credibility with board certification? Visit nanp.org today to apply.
Keep in mind that the information on the NANP podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical or legal advice. The NANP is not liable or responsible for any harm, damage, or illness arising from the use of the information contained herein. By listening to the information on this podcast, you agree to defend, indemnify, and hold harmless the NANP and all agents. Copyright NANP, all rights reserved.